Well, good evening, everybody. It's very good of you to let me try and tease out the history of the fabled cathedral at Barchester uh, in this hallowed circle. I need to start my tale with my dear wife, Jane, who's listening downstairs. She's tolerated my strange obsession with the Harding, Grantley, and Proudie families for 50 years and more. The thing is that Jane sings in our church choir, which is a seriously good church choir. We do have the finest organ of any parish church in Devon, as a matter of fact, at St. Peter's, Budley Salterton. Now, some years ago, the choir had a very dynamic director of music, and she would take us all, even mere camp followers like myself, away every summer to one of the ancient cathedrals to sing all the services for 3 or 4 days while their own resident choir was on holiday. Now, I can't sing, or that's to say, I sing very beautifully in the bath, but I just cannot sing with another chorister. Hence, I am let off the choir, or band, I guess. So I came to spend long magical days every summer in the close and the cloister and inside some new to me cathedral, drinking in the extraordinary atmosphere which these places do have. We went to Durham and York, Peterborough, Southwark, twice to Westminster Abbey, which isn't a cathedral, but it's pretty special all the same. Winchester, Salisbury, Wells, and Exeter, just to name a few. Many of them have existed for 14 centuries. They may have been rebuilt in whole or in part, sometimes repeatedly, but some magic does still seem to adhere to those ancient stones and their wonderful carvings and shrines and chapels and cloisters. Now, the more I mused on this, the stranger it seemed to me, I mean, really extraordinary, that Anthony Trollope never published one single word about his cathedral, despite all the wondrous tales he tells us of the shenanigans in the close and a few in the choir. Neither is there one single word on the history of this major historic edifice. In fact, he tells us just a little more, though that is enigmatic, about the Archdeacon Grantley's own church out at Plumstead Episcopi. He says, although one knows by rule that the old priests who built it wrong, one cannot bring oneself to wish that they should have made it other than it is. As an architect and a historian, I thought his silence about the greater church a tragic oversight. By this time, I thought I knew Anthony, as I see we now address the master, quite well. And I decided I must try to design his cathedral myself and invent the history which he would have given us had his prolific mind ever strayed in that direction. Everything in the novels suggests that Barchester was one of the most ancient and beautiful and distinguished of our great English cathedrals. I also thought that as Anthony had this extraordinary ability to describe the persons, the feelings and the minds of young women, his cathedral would certainly have been founded and ruled by a woman. I therefore decided that Barchester started as a Saxon minster, founded and ruled by a royal princess. That was in fact quite common in the early Saxon period. And as they had 7 kingdoms, they were pretty flush with princesses. And incidentally, those princesses by and large were very well educated, and not just the rubbish that women were given in later Middle Ages. They were taught the classics and they were taught theology and all sorts of serious studies. And also, very interestingly, Saxon women could own and manage and donate property, which their northern sisters couldn't. So they did found a lot of churches, several of which turned into cathedrals at a later date. There would be just a few tame male priests kept under a separate roof to celebrate the sacraments. From this, it would naturally have become monastic, as exactly half our medieval cathedrals were monastic. And thanks to the marauding heathen Danes, it would undoubtedly have been trashed and virtually abandoned, and then refounded as a Benedictine house for men only around AD 900. Thus far, thus relatively straightforward. Slide 3, please, Don. I then had to try and explain how a tiny Saxon minster evolved over some 6 centuries into a major Gothic cathedral. And I admit that this did involve some leaps of faith. I don't think Anthony ever had much to say about medieval monasticism. I started with the cats. Every great church in history has of sheer necessity had a resident mouser. If you've ever been in the roof of somewhere like Exeter or Winchester, as I have, you can see that it's a paradise for birds, and you're going to need a cat, at least one cat, to keep it in control. The Reverend Professor Nicholas Orme has published a scholarly work on the cathedral cats of Exeter, who had a paid custodian known as Custos Cato, and Moggy herself had a separate designated salary. Truth to tell, I was away with fairies by now, but I did attempt some serious research, scouring ancient libraries for all they could tell me about great Benedictine cathedrals, and virtually half of our medieval cathedrals were monastic. My reader's ticket for the Pusey House Library in Oxford, which I shall cherish till I die, is actually inscribed in Latin. And I have a wonderful story about that library if we have time later on. Now, the heritage of English cathedrals really is something pretty remarkable. We were an unimportant, impoverished island off the north coast of Europe, with no special claim to fame or fortune. Some quirk of history led to our dioceses generally being much larger than those on the continent, and a few of them, particularly Canterbury with Thomas and Durham with Cuthbert, were thought to have very powerful saints. Whatever the reason, some of our ancient cathedrals did become major historic buildings on any test. Before it burnt down in the Great Fire of 1666, Old St. Paul's was actually the biggest church in the world. And the not insignificant Baroque number that was designed for us by my namesake Wren after the Great Fire is no mean church, but it's much smaller than Old St. Paul's. It's not nearly as long, it's not as wide, and Old St. Paul's had the tallest steeple in the world, much taller than Ulm, which is the tallest today. Winchester is still the longest cathedral anywhere on earth. And since the building of St. Peter's, in Rome, York Minster became, and does remain, the largest church north of the Alps. But we never did soaring high vaults as the French did. We very seldom, arguably just the once at Salisbury, did a whole cathedral to one design. In fact, many English cathedrals are a hodgepodge with a soaring Gothic vault built off a stumpy Norman or Romanesque arcade. Barchester is one of those quintessentially English cathedrals, and I would say all the more lovable for that. It's worth remembering that before the railway age, cathedrals were by far the largest man-made structures, the largest thing anybody had ever seen. I suppose the Great Pyramid might have given them a run for their money, but nothing north of the Alps could compare at all. Now, I have a theory that the explanation of Anthony's reticence about his cathedral could lie in those last few facts. He was, of course, by upbringing and education, an impoverished Georgian gentleman, but undoubtedly a gentleman. He was actually born in the Regency, but was educated and commenced his civil service career under George IV and William IV. And Georgian gentlemen didn't reckon much to the Gothic. They were steeped in classical studies, and they tended to think that any real architecture needs must hark back to Greece or Rome. Anthony did become a Victorian in his maturity, especially relishing the torrent of technology and science that came with the likes of Brunel and Wedgwood and Davy. Indeed, his very successful post office career was built on the back of sophisticated new communications, telegraph, turnpikes, railways, and steamships. Yet, he clearly loved the close at Salisbury, where he first conceived the plot of the Warden. Herein lies a mystery. Human beings are never simple, and Trollope, for all his many virtues, and I would rate him a thoroughly decent and good man, as well as a brilliant creative genius, was certainly not simple. My book is in effect a series of short stories to illustrate the way people lived and worked around a great church, and how the church itself was built and rebuilt through the ages. I've written at roughly 150-year intervals down to the Reformation, and then every century until 1900, when I changed to 50-year intervals. I must first put your mind at rest, all you learned members of the Trollope Society, that I have put no words into the mouths of any of Anthony's characters, nor have I written a single word about the actual times when those larger-than-life people infested the Barchester Close, though I do remind my readers once or twice that they existed. And I have dared to spin a few yarns about the earlier history of leading Barset families. I'd better say a quick word here about historical fiction and the use of sources. You may be surprised to hear from someone embarked on this quixotic venture that I am no fan of historical fiction. I think when writers do put words into the mouths of real historic figures, or invent fictitious events among real history, they can seriously distort our self-understanding as a people, and I regard that as a criminal offence. It goes without saying that all history is in some degree subjective, of course. Good historians try to understand original sources, be they archaeological, primary written records, or contemporary interpretations. They use genetic data, dendrochronological sampling, ground-penetrating radar, textual analysis, and many other scientific studies. We can never reach absolute truth about the past, but serious historians certainly bring us very much closer, and I believe that's a crucially important service to society. Anthony Trollope was no historian. He was a very sensitive and penetrating novelist who worked to self-declared high standards of moral values that were profoundly important to him. It follows that his characters are completely non-historical. So am I. I have tried to give my readers a bit of fun. I also wanted to illustrate how technology, trading patterns, climatic change, international relations, and political forces have affected the way ordinary people live in all ages. Thus, the departure of the Romans, the invasion of the Teutonic pagans, the Danish trauma, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the so-called Glorious Revolution, the industrial and scientific revolutions, the growth and demise of empire, and the two German wars, each had a profound effect on everyday lives right across our island. I have a few chapters on the long period when Barchester. I'm sorry, I've forgotten to wind on the slides. Dom, could you go slowly through the next 3 slides, please? I'm very sorry. I have a few chapters on the long period when Barchester was monastic. That is, the full 7 monastic offices were sung in the choir every single day and at night by the monks. We now know quite a lot about the way these great monastic English cathedrals operated. For instance, the extensive account rolls of Norwich Cathedral Priory have been studied closely in recent years and produced some extraordinary insights, such as the fact that 10,000 eggs a week were delivered to Norwich Priory. They ran a significant welfare state with much hospitality, medicine and education. At times, of course, there were tensions between the ascetic ideals of the early monastic pioneers and the worldly power that their latter-day priors exercised as great feudal magnates. So that is what they all slowly became. I've tried to illustrate all this by yarns about folk inside and outside the monastery itself. Incidentally, that slide Dom's put up now is another one with rather a nice story attached to it, which we might have time for later on. Barchester, I decided, had never produced any major saint, nor the ensuing cultus and vast pilgrimage that did enrich some other cathedrals. However, I do refer to two saintly figures. First was the foundress, Hilda Giffey, as mentioned earlier, was the royal princess who endowed her fledgling minster with her own estates. Some of her properties are still on the terrier today. She stood up to her bishop, who was of far humbler birth, and forced him to treat her nuns with respect. The second was an illiterate nun called Ethelfrida, who heroically continued the full daily worship single-handed after the calamity of the Danish raid. She subsequently became an anchoress and a muse to the small surviving community. Neither lady was ever canonized, which was sickening male chauvinism. In my AD 1300 chapter, there's a blazing row between the priory miller and the cellarer. This is caused by the discovery that the miller had been surreptitiously tampering with the hatches on the mill leat at dead of night to increase the flow to his wheel. Now that's a breach of immemorial custom and the unquestioned right of the priory to control all watercourses within the demesne. In the end, the miller prevailed, as they all must have flour. I explain how the great parlour of the prior's lodging would mutate into the drawing room of Mrs. Proudie, and that's the room with the magnificent Gothic oriel window by the south transept from the chapter house that will allow that tigress to glower down the close to see what Obadiah Slope is up to today. Anthony Trollope famously did not do dates. Those with a fair knowledge of general history can usually pin his tales down to the nearest decade, but no closer. He could sometimes be a bit cavalier about public events as well. There is one striking exception, when he gives us a very precise date for the death of, quotes, one John Harum under his will. Under his will, Harum bequeathed Harum's butts and Harum's patch to provide a site and endowment for decayed wool carders. The terms of this will are essentially the root of the whole plot of the Warden and quite a bit of Barchester Towers. It's the alleged misuse of the endowed funds that cost poor Septimus Harding his beloved home and almost drove his fearsome father-in-law to death by apoplexy. Anthony tells us nothing of the construction of the hospital, nor of its early bedesmen. I've dared to fill the gaps by describing the visit of a couple of young novices to see the first bedesmen comfortably settled into their spanking new home. Slide 8, please. We have, no, sorry, but 8. I missed that one. That's it, thank you. Then I had to describe the Reformation and the distressing effect that long trauma had on our ancient churches. It all started, of course, with Henry the Much-Beddied, who suppressed the priory. But real change came to the cathedrals later than that bloated uxorious side. I've tried very hard to be even-handed, having indeed much personal sympathy with both sides. I was assisted here by the fact that Anthony, who was by the standards of stout, heavily bearded, fox-hunting Victorian males, quite remarkably even-handed in his views on church controversies. He seems to have been a moderately high church Anglican all his life in his own beliefs and practice. Still, he had a great regard for the Gaelic Catholic folk he'd hunted with and grown to like so well in Ireland. He even extended that to a considerable respect for many of their priests. I think one of his most attractive heroes is Father John McGrath in the MacDermots of Ballycloran, which the Society is due to read soon. I have tried to follow humbly in his admirable footsteps on all of this. The suppression of the great houses in 1539 forced the senior monks to face a very difficult dilemma. Either they could find a wife double quick and grow their hair, or they could get out and, if they were lucky, find a minor clerical post elsewhere. The great majority seem to have pumped for option A. I often wonder about those wives. Were they happy? How were they found? There were no dating apps. Seemingly, their husbands mostly retained their former position in the administration and got on with the job. What about the wives? Nobody knows. I dare to hazard a guess. Slide 9, please. The 18th century was a difficult task, as the fact is that the English cathedrals sank into a long stupor. The clergy were very prosperous. Almost all were products of Oxbridge, mostly younger sons of the landed gentry or the nobility. Many had private means. All had generous prebends and gracious canonries, staffed with obsequious servants. The cathedrals themselves were neglected barbarously. Some fell into near terminal decline. Services were usually maintained, but often led by minor clerics, while the canons themselves swanned around in smart society or hunted. It was all very sad and had a tragic effect on national unity, as the huge new industrial cities springing up at that time were neglected and left wide open to the burgeoning nonconformists. Things would change radically in the mid-19th century, when Anthony was writing the book, with the furious growth of both High Church, or Tractarian or Oxford movement, and the opposing evangelical wing. The two were bitterly divided, but both thought that cathedrals were important. Both slowly implemented structural repairs and rejuvenation of worship. The trouble was that they wanted diametrically different forms of worship. I've had a bit of fun trying to depict these tensions among my fictional deans and canons, who came to blows over such matters as surplices and chasubles, incense and reliquaries. Then there was the Blitz. I have, maybe a bit fancifully, suggested that the desolation wrought by Hitler was a little like that inflicted by Guthrum a millennium before. I do vividly remember myself, as a child, seeing the ghastly mess that was Exeter Cathedral after the Luftwaffe destroyed the South Choir Aisle and its chapel. There were raking shores propping up bits of aisle that had stood there since the Normans built the foundations. There was tarpaulin and corrugated iron trying to keep the lower aisle roofs almost watertight. There were craters around the close, thanks to Herr Baedeker. Everything was black. I now realize that was largely due to pre-war soot, but I didn't know that as a child, and hence my undying horror at the memory. Finally, I've attempted to peer into the future and to see what effect the technological revolution may have on the great church. Oh, could we have the next slide as well? Thank you. um, how maintenance could be improved by techniques such as IT, artificial intelligence, ground penetrating radar, drones, and 3D printing. The cathedrals are now used intensively throughout the year for concerts and drama and a whole range of secular activities, but they still maintain a regular pattern of worship day in and day out, as they have for well over a millennium, and in many cases, a millennium and a half. All of this, I suggest, will continue far into the future, as will the cats. Some members of our members in North America may not know the works of the late Sir Nicolaus Pevsner. Pevsner wrote a huge series of books, giving detailed architectural descriptions of every significant historic building in England. Sir Nicolaus strangely failed to include Barset in his scholarly series. I have therefore written a pseudo-Pevsner with a detailed description of our cathedral as it is now. The great man, being an art historian, could be pretty waspish about anything he thought out of period or of inferior design or workmanship. He's very damning about the Barchester Reredos, and he also writes with great hauteur about the fourth Duke of Omnium and his grandiloquent pastiche at Gatherum Castle. We Trolopians are glad it was built because it gave Glencora scope for such fantastic parties, to the great grief of her Lord Duke Plantagenet. We all remember how a house party, her late uncle-in-laws, the last Duke, had caused so cruel and prolonged an agony for poor Mark Robarts. It finally cost him the canonry that he so lusted after. In art historical terms, it was also a disaster. Gatherum, my Pevsner suggests, had been the main palace of the medieval bishops. It was virtually obliterated by the fourth Duke. Pseudo-Pevsner can only find a few faint traces buried away in the stable quadrangle. Next slide, please. And one more. Lovely. So that's how I conceive Barchester Cathedral to look today. Now, how are we doing for time? I thought I might lower the intellectual tone of the society a little if Dom would give us the final slide. This is a model I've built of my railway. I have a literary railway around my studio, which starts in Hardy country with the junction at Casterbridge. But then I drilled a hole through my bookshelf and brought it into Barchester Central, which you can see here. The cathedral, of course, in the background. You can just see on the right the oriel window through which Mrs. Proudie glowered at Slimy Slope. On the extreme left is, sorry, my cousin flashed up a message there, which threw me completely, although I'm very fond of this cousin. This is Hiram's Hospital on the extreme left, and the only beadsman who's capable of climbing stairs is Bunce. So it's old Bunce up there who's about to lower the pennant, which has to be done every night before compline. In the center, you can see the Grantley Arms, and there's a big Venetian window in each gable, which lights the ballroom. And it's there that all the young girls of the Grantleys and the Luftons and all the other families go to tread the light fantastic and hopefully find a husband. Though, of course, Griselda Grantley is aiming a lot higher than that subscription ball. The west wing of Barchester Central Station is the buffet, naturally called the Trollop. And you can see there's a lot of naughty schoolboys piling in there for half a pint before the next express is due in. And finally, over to the right, You can just see the rear end of a Rolls Royce with a chauffeur, with a uniformed chauffeur in the driving seat. Now, he's been given special permission by the Great Western to park there because the bishop's been up to the House of Lords to vote against trains on Sundays and is due back at 9 o'clock. And I think really, I hope I've whetted your appetite for Barchester Cathedral, but I think I'd better stop.